Welcome once again, fight fans, DAZN MMA. I'm Sean O'Connell, joined as always by Dan Hardy, and the rumor mill is turning. Just this last week, conversations sparked up again about the possibility that Bellator and the Professional Fighters League are headed toward a buyout or a merger or some combination of those things, maybe a partnership. Scott Coker has acknowledged that those conversations are happening. PFL president of fighter operations after the PFL event this weekend acknowledged the same thing. Dan Hardy, Bellator plus PFL. I love it. What do you think?
I love it as well. I love it as well. You know, you look at the Bellator roster and they've got some really, really solid champions across all the weight classes, and there are several fighters that you could just see stepping straight into the PFL championships right now and being very competitive. If not the favorite, you've got to think. What I would like to see though is both organizations do a partnership and put forward one fighter from each weight class who is their champion. Do you know what I mean? Like Armies used to do in the past. You've seen Troy, they send that giant dude out who fought in Pride. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Like we could put a champion in from each weight class and then, we'll keep scoring. We'll see what happens. But ultimately, I'd love to see the rosters come together. It would be a powerhouse of a move for both organizations, and it would immediately put it would put the PFL and Bellator straight on a competitive level with the UFC. I would think in a lot of different weight classes. I think people look at Bellator and recognize that there are some fighters there that could quite easily step over and be competitive for world titles in the UFC, and I think we feel the same about some of the weight classes in the PFL as well. So bringing those two rosters together, then we've got we've got a superset of champions, and I think that the fans would be incredibly excited to see some of those fights.
I mean, I just want the opportunity to strengthen, the depth of talent on both rosters. And obviously biased, and I would say I just want everything to be called Professional Fighters League. I want the Bellator brand to disappear and for that merger to be like under the PFL umbrella, because I think the format is better. I think, the true season, regular season, playoffs and championship situation is better. I know that there are a lot of those those Bellator champions would say, no, I want to be part of the super fight division. I want to come over and be part of the pay-per-view product. And maybe they've earned that right as, Bellator champions. I can't imagine telling a guy like Patricio Pitbull, like, no, sorry, you got to go through a season and win the season once or twice before we put you in a pay-per-view. But I mean, most of those guys aren't that firmly established, right? So I love the idea. Bellator has done its Grand Prix. They've done a tournament style of crowning champions, but their timeline is way longer, right? I mean, it's 2 or 3 fights in 18 months in order to get to the end of that Grand Prix. I want to see those same people put to the test in the PFL format. Give them 4 fights in 8 months and see if they're built for it. That's why it's the toughest test in combat sports. Right? That's why it's the toughest test in all sports, because this is the most difficult sport on planet Earth, if you ask me. So finding the most difficult format for the most difficult sport means that you're really putting people to the test. And to be frank, I think that a lot of those Bellator champions, upper crust Bellator talents would give everyone in the PFL a run for their money. You might have half of your PFL champions be people that come from the Bellator merger. But what's wrong with that? The sport has been sucked into this like crossover entertainment type and gotten away from the true sports format in the league that has dominated, right? In the UFC, they're doing it half and half. They got one foot in the true sport format. They got the other foot in the WWE format with the, biggest trash talkers and loudest mouths being rewarded. And that's fine. That's their business model. It's been very successful. I'm not here to question it. But for a sports fan, the idea that you're going to get another massive chunk of the best worldwide talent and you're going to plug them in to this true sports format that crowns champions based on meritocracy, that's only good for the sport, right? I don't care whether it's a Bellator person or a PFL person that emerges at the end of the 2024 season, we say, as the champ, because you can hit the reset button in 2025 and do it all over again. You can go back to the drawing board and you do it all over again. That's one of the beauties of the PFL format. I mean, look what's already happened in the PFL season, Dan. Brendan Loughnane, 2022 champion, not even in the playoffs. Ante Dillia, 2022 heavyweight champion, not even in the playoffs, right? That's what happens in the NFL. That's what happens in the NBA. That's what happens in hockey and baseball. And I don't watch it, but I assume that's what happens every now and again in Premier League soccer. You get a new champion every year.
You're asking the wrong person when it comes to soccer. I have no idea. Unless people are punching each other in the face, I don't tend to watch it. Ice hockey, now you're talking. Yeah, I agree. I think, and especially, when we look at what Larissa Pacheco did on Friday as well, like you just think to yourself, okay, if she storms her way through this featherweight division and she's a two-weight champion, it's not going to be Nunes because she's going to be locked down in retirement. She's not going to be allowed to do anything for the next 10 years unless she's in the octagon. So, the next best option for me is Cyborg. And I think Cyborg carries a lot of weight to her name as well. She's a terrifying individual. And I think given the fact that Pacheco has a similar kind of style, it would be an absolute war of a fight. And Bellator have done things with Rising as well, and I like what Rising do. I love their gloves. They've got really cool gloves, and they've got really cool showmanship around their events. But they've struggled with consistency as well. Same with Bellator. I like the fact that they're both open to it, and I think if the Bellator thing comes together, whether it's a merger or a purchase by PFL, it opens the door to working with other organizations as well. I mean, even One Championship have got a few good guys that I would like to see come over and fight in the PFL as well. And I think Bellator and PFL being open to that will also show other promotions around the world that it's possible and profitable to be open to it.
A merger of two major mixed martial arts organizations, or a purchase of one entity by another entity, is certainly not without precedent in this sport, right? It happened when the Zuffa-owned UFC absorbed the WEC, right?
Yep.
And that we saw what happened, right? Most of the upper weight class, the 185, 205, whatever, most of those individuals kind of either faded into obscurity as the bottom half of a UFC roster, or they just disappeared altogether. But what you got was, Uriah Faber, who ended up being a WEC star and a UFC star, Anthony Pettis, who was a star in the WEC and the UFC and PFL, right? Like, yep. You saw the UFC absorb Pride, and again, a lot of those Pride fighters never saw the light of day in the UFC, but the upper crust talent ended up moving on to star turns in the UFC, right? So this is not without precedent in the industry, and it was good when it happened with the WEC, strengthen the UFC's roster. It was good when it happened with Pride, strengthen the UFC's roster. If the PFL is in a position to strengthen their roster through absorbing Bellator fighters, they're just following a model that has been successful in the sport before, and I love the idea, because just like with WEC champions going on to become UFC champions, just like Pride contenders and champions going on to become UFC contenders and champions, I would expect the same thing if Bellator fighters came into the PFL.
Absolutely. I mean, you named some really good ones. Jose Aldo's another one. Cub Swanson, Cowboy, they all came over from WEC. The one that stands out to me, which is not necessarily it was not a championship fight, but it was Korean Zombie against Leonard Garcia. I mean, that's one of the wildest fights that you'll ever see. If you're a fight fan and you've not watched that, go back and watch Korean Zombie against Leonard Garcia. It's one of the reasons why people love Korean Zombie so much. But that rematch happened in the UFC, Like, there's been so many good fighters that have stepped over and done well, and I feel like because the UFC holds such high ground, people automatically assume that the fighters on that roster are just better than everybody else, but it's absolutely not the case. I mean, like, look at Demetrius Johnson going over to One Championship and lost to Moraes. That was mind blowing. People didn't think that was going to happen ever. And, someone I ran into in my career, Carlos Condit, who was the welterweight champion at WEC, came over and won the interim title in the UFC. A very formidable fighter. Took my head off in London. I'll never forget that day. It was, he's a very, very good fighter. And again, when he came over to the UFC, I didn't think to myself, oh, well, we're the UFC and you're WEC, so we're automatically better. Like, as fighters, we know that the playing field's a lot more even than the promoters would allow you to think. And with these cross promotions, it's good for the fights because then we see that the playing field's more even. But then if you are holding the higher ground like the UFC does, you don't want to show that the fact that the competition is out there for UFC champions. I'm excited about it. I really hope it comes to pass. I think the PFL are doing great things. Scott Coker and Bellator have always done really good things. I've always had good interactions with Bellator as well, and their fighters have always spoke highly of them. So, it's an exciting time. I hope something comes of it because those two rosters coming together would be ridiculous.
It'd be amazing. Also, when I think of previous mergers, Dan Henderson was a Pride fighter, right?
Yep.
Who came over to the UFC. Can you imagine trying to tell the story of all the great fights that have happened in the UFC, some of the great UFC rivalries, without using Dan Henderson's name because that merger never happened? Or trying to tell the story of all the great fights that ever happened in the UFC without knowing about Shogun Rua because he was part of Pride and was only fighting at 3 a.m. U.S. time, right? Like that merger helped build the UFC into what it is today. The same is true, as you brought up with many great examples, of the WEC UFC merger, right? I'm looking at that level of potential for guys who come over from Bellator or the merger with Bellator and the PFL to create those types of fights, those types of storylines that become foundational to the history of the company and foundational to the history of the sport. That's what is potentially at stake with a PFL Bellator merger. I certainly hope it happens, and I trust that the bosses at the PFL who've had like a really singular vision to move these things forward and to move this company forward are going to make something significant happen. Whether it's that Bellator merger or not, in the next 3 years, the PFL is only going to be pushing higher and further and doing things that are not only great for the PFL, but that are great for the sport of mixed martial arts, because that's what they've done so far. Only 5 years in, Dan Hardy, already broadcasting on ESPN, already creating Sports Center highlights, already brought the best heavyweight on the planet into the fold in Francis Ngannou, and created really broke new ground in the sport of mixed martial arts by not just giving him the money that he was asking for, but by guaranteeing that his opponents would be paid what they're worth, and by giving him an executive role effectively as the chairman of PFL Africa. Like in only 5 years, this company has changed the landscape of mixed martial arts and changed what it means to be an elite level fighter in the sport of mixed martial arts. So if I'm a Bellator fighter, I'm hoping that the PFL buys me. I'm hoping that the PFL buys my contract and decides, you know what, we think that this guy can be a big addition for us, because the PFL has elevated the possibilities for every fighter on the planet.
Very, very exciting. So I'm keeping everything crossed. Sean. I recommend you do the same thing. We'll get there. I feel confident. I feel very confident. Like you said, we're covering so much ground with the PFL, and MMA is bigger now than it ever has been before, but it will always be bigger than it is today from this point onwards. I keep saying that to people. It's growing. It will never be smaller than it is right now. It's always going to be bigger. It's going to keep growing. We're going to keep, we have a tournament coming up in the UK right now. It's either going to be the 4 Nations or the 5 Nations amateur tournament. We'll have 200 fighters over 3 days in the UK. It's the biggest MMA event that's ever happened in the UK. And they're just amateurs, and I'm going to be there scouting for PFL, ready to sign some of that new talent, like Biagio Ali Walsh, still amateur, looking at maybe turning pro soon. Like the future talent is scary, and we want to make sure that playing field is broad and profitable for all of them. And I think we're moving in that direction.